Thank you all for joining and welcome for today's webinar, Reliable Demand Forecasting and Price Promotions in Uncertain Markets. My name is Ben Schubert. I have the pleasure of hosting this webinar. I'll briefly introduce myself and our two speakers, Sarvesh and Hans. But before that, just a few housekeeping notes. So we have a presentation, or actually two presentations that each last about 15 minutes. So we will have time for questions at the end. We'd love to have your questions. If you have a question, just type them in the chat of the meeting as they come up, and we'll collect them and sort them and ask them at the end. We are also recording today's webinar for people who cannot join today, so they can watch it at a convenient time for them. And we will send out the slides to this webinar to the people who attended today. So introductions. My name is Ben Schubert. I spent a sizable time of my professional career within the Nielsen company, and specifically in a part of Nielsen that deals with innovation and forecasting new products. So forecasting is a field that I'm naturally interested in. So I'm very excited about today and what I'm going to learn. More recently, I've been working a lot with startups in the analytical space, and I'm also a mentor for Oxford University Innovation. This is where Sarvesh and I met. So enough about me, let's introduce today's speakers. So first, Hans Venstra from Nielsen IQ. Hans has an extensive analytical background of 25 years, during which he has worked with many different manufacturers and retailers. He has led the analytical teams for Nielsen IQ in the Netherlands and Belgium, and he is now leading the Nielsen IQ Partner Network, which is a global collaboration model where Nielsen IQ works with selected companies to deliver specific services to the CPG industry. And Hans will be our first speaker today. And then let me now also introduce Sarvesh. Sarvesh Kumar is the founder and CEO of Singular Intelligence. He's a tech entrepreneur who has built successful businesses in the space of decision augmentation, and we'll learn more about that today. And Singular Intelligence is building AI technology for decision and insights augmentation to tackle the problem of poor quality insights and the lack of timely information, which leads to wrong or at least suboptimal decisions that bring enormous costs with them. So with an AI product designed for businesses, it is possible to significantly lower the cost than compared to ad hoc solutions. And Singular Intelligence is trying to change the game by offering these new services. So now let me hand over to Hans to kick us off today.
Okay, thank you very much, Ben, and good morning or good afternoon, everyone. So let me start by explaining why forecasting is important. Obviously, it is a hot topic, and even more since the pandemic. But clearly, forecasting is a lot more than just nice to know. It is required to set goals. So when you have more accurate data about the upcoming year, it will be a lot easier to decide what levels of sales will be determined as a success, for example. A good forecast will also help you to budget. So based on the forecast that you make, budget and time of people can be allocated on things like products, hiring, and adjusting strategy, for example. But the ultimate goal in the end is to optimize financial results. And that could be in the form of reduction of out of stocks, for example, or to optimize inventory cost. And having a good forecast is important to manage all this. So there's a couple of reasons why forecasting has become more important. And I know that in presentations and webinar, it's always popular to say that the past was simple and today's world is complex. But I think it's fair to say that it does hold for forecasting as well. I won't say that forecasting was an easy job before COVID, but for sure it has become much more complicated due to the pandemic. not just in the first year, but COVID is still not over yet, and new waves could still be possible. So it's still having a big impact. But it's not just COVID alone. Also think about the high inflation that we have, and for example, the situation in Ukraine. So the events and incidents that we see in the last few years have become bigger and also more sudden, and consequently, they also have a big impact on companies' results. So the ability to forecast more accurately is becoming more and more important. So who are actually using forecasting? I'd like to go through a couple of groups who are very much interested in forecasting. So the heavy user group are the people who are demand planners. So they are interested in forecasting at the most detailed level, which means that they need to forecast on an ongoing basis for the next couple of weeks, months, or even years. So this is really very important for them to be on top of it. Another user group are the data scientists, and what they do is develop forecasting models, and their focus is really to improve forecast accuracies and also to add efficiencies to the forecasting process. And the third group would be the marketing and sales teams, and this group usually has a different need. So they need to make plans for the next year. They need to make decisions about products, price, promo, media, etc. And what they like to see is what is driving their sales and what is the impact if different scenarios would be run if these drivers are changed. So for sales and marketing, the forecasting needs are usually less frequent. In the past, maybe just once a year at the beginning of the planning cycle. But with these volatile markets that we experienced over the past few years, we also see at Nielsen that we get a growing number of questions about forecasting and updates of forecasts. And simply, yeah, that simply is because your latest forecast can already be outdated within 1 or 2 months. And that's really a change compared to a couple of years ago. So next question would be, okay, how do companies forecast, and then in particular marketing and sales? And of course, it varies a lot across companies. And despite the fast development in technology, it may be surprising, but we still see a lot of companies, even leading CPG companies, that are still forecast in Excel. And a common way to forecast this way is to look at past data, historical data, and create certain types of averages. So you can do it in different manners, but you can take, for example, the average of the last 3 years, or you can make a CAGR measure. Either way, if you would apply it to, let's say, a pre-COVID situation, so we can see that in the left chart, it's a very normal case where there's a category that shows a growth rate of around 2-3%. You can calculate the average of the CAGR, and you would get to an estimate, for example, of 2 or 2.2% for 2022. Now, that's not really a crazy estimate. It's very likely that it will be close to that number. But things are different in times where there's a lot more fluctuation, as we can see in the right chart. So again, one category, but now including the COVID impact. So we see a big jump in sales in 2020 because of COVID. And of course, technically, you can still make an average, but it's not very likely that you're going to have an average sales, an average of COVID years and non-COVID years. It's simply not really realistic. So just looking at averages of past sales does not work anymore. So some companies try to estimate future sales in a bit more sophisticated way by looking at rolling total sales. And the advantage of this approach is that you can take out seasonality effects that you would see on a weekly basis. And with this, you can try and identify a certain trend in the data and simply try to extend that trend in a logical manner. So in this example, we're looking at the category toilet soap in the Netherlands. And as you can see, it was very stable before COVID. So these are moving annual totals. And with COVID, the sales went up significantly. And a year after COVID, the question is, well, what will happen next? And in the past, you would just extend the trend line, but clearly this would not be realistic to assume that this high growth would continue. So the most common scenario at this point in time was that COVID was just a one-year circumstance. And so you would expect actually a big drop in sales in the second year. And of course, this is something you can try and bring into your forecast by making certain adjustments, manual adjustments. So how would that look like? Well, take the same example. One scenario could be that the demand for soap would stay at the same high level if you would assume that consumers would stick to the habit of washing their hands very frequently. And in that case, the orange dotted line could be the forecast. Another and more common scenario would be that the sales would go back to normal with a certain pace. And in that case, the moving annual sales would gradually drop, as you can see in the extended green line. And this is a very common scenario that a lot of companies applied last year. And although it may not be perfect, but it does seem to be a reasonable way of looking at it. It makes sense. You make some assumptions, you take the baseline pre-COVID and you combine these things. And yeah, that could work, you would say. However, there are a couple of challenges with this approach. First, you need to assume what the normal trend would be without COVID. And the example that I showed you for toilet soap was actually extremely simple because the sales were almost flat before COVID. In reality, for most categories, this is a lot more difficult to determine because there's more fluctuation in the trend before COVID. Then there's also another practical factor. In order to create some sort of a baseline, you do need to have enough of historical data. And we're now in 22. So to have a lot of weeks before COVID becomes a little bit more difficult because a typical Nielsen database contains 3 years of data. So that's just a practical hurdle. Post-COVID, you would need to determine when and how quickly sales would go back to normal and also to what extent. And this is obviously also rather subjective and can have quite a big impact on the end result. So the forecast approach that I just showed you could work if COVID just was a one-off incident, but as we all know, it wasn't. So COVID stayed in the second year. So you can't just assume that your scenario of dropping sales will hold, and there's not really a lot of guidance what you could do to also readjust for that circumstance. The last challenge I would like to mention is that there are of course other drivers than COVID only. So clearly COVID had a lot of impact, not for every category, but there's also things like the summer. So there was a poor summer in 21, at least in the Netherlands, or it could be that you've increased your prices prior to COVID, and this is really messing up your baseline. So it's all rather complicated to correct for all that. So there's a lot you can do in Excel, and I'm also personally a big fan of Excel and try to maximize all this. And you can take it either through to a even higher level by using regression models that you can do in Excel. But the thing is that Excel is not really the best tool to isolate all these different effects. And basically that is what you would need to do to create an accurate forecast. So I think it's fair to say that traditional forecast methods have become outdated. In today's pretty complex environment with the pandemic, but also the prices and the situation in Ukraine, etc., basic forecasting methods simply have a rather low accuracy. Apart from that, we also need to realize that it has become a lot more time consuming to forecast because you need to make manual adjustments, and this makes the whole process more error sensitive, also more difficult to repeat when circumstances change or if you want to run different scenarios. A last point that I also would like to mention is the dependency on just one or two people. So what we see a lot in companies is that there's just one Excel king who is doing this type of analysis. And with the growing need for forecasting work, it could very well be that this person is really busy, doesn't have the time anymore, or maybe even left the company. And then suddenly there is a problem. So I think it is important for companies to consider upgrading to a more competitive gear. And this also involves other ways of forecasting. And that takes us to the future of forecasting that is based on AI. And AI-based forecasting has become very popular in recent years, and there are many companies that are using AI. But what exactly is AI? I think for many people, AI is still something spacey, futuristic. You think about robots, and for some people, it may even be scary because AI can even develop its own morals. But what way AI can, or AI in the space of forecasting is actually pretty cool. So what exactly is AI-based forecasting? Well, of course, there are plenty of different definitions, but simply said, AI can be defined as the ability of a software or computer program to learn and think like humans do. So it's using so-called machine learning algorithms that do that. Now, modeling as such is, of course, not new, but in the past, companies often work with just one or two models and that were fed with different variables. But with AI, you can work with a lot more models. So it could be 5, 10, up to 20 models, maybe even more. And the AI engine is actually capable of selecting the model that is delivering the best accuracy. It can even combine different models if that would bring the accuracy to a higher level. Another component is that in AI forecasting, it is possible to include many variables and really a lot. So not just, let's say, the standard Nielsen sales measures, but also think about weather, Google mobility data, anything that can be relevant for your sales prediction. So also future data. So think about public forecasts or COVID cases that are expected. So all these things can be included in such models. To link all that data together is actually also quite complicated, but AI can also help to automate that process. For humans, it is often not possible to determine relationships between all these different multiple variables at the same time. And this is also one of the characteristics of AI. AI can do this. And because of the computational power, it is also a lot easier and faster to run different scenarios and to do that at scale. So as a bridge to the next speaker, I would like to quickly introduce the Nielsen Partner Network to you. So it was already mentioned a little bit at the beginning. So the Nielsen Partner Network is a collaboration between Nielsen IQ and other companies. And what these companies have in common is that they deliver what we call a combined service. So that service includes Nielsen IQ data. And we work with more than 100 partners globally at the moment. And this can be in many different areas. So think, for example, about reporting, could be data integration, data harmonization, consultancy, but also modeling. And at Nielsen, we also have our own solutions in modeling, but we also work with partners. And Singular Intelligence is a partner of us who is active in the space of modeling and specifically in forecasting. So I think it's very interesting to learn from Singular Intelligence a bit more about this topic. And with that, I would like to hand it over to Sarvesh. Thank you.
Hans, thank you very much. Very elaborate and clear explanation in context setting. We will continue from where you have left. I like the example of toilet soap that you had given. How in the COVID scenario, it's changing. There is a very interesting story we have, which I'll request Rahul to pick up when he talks about driver decomposition, how consumer behavior shift happened in a particular country between the bar, the toilet soap bar, and this liquid version of the soap. And it kept on shifting depending upon the macroeconomic and COVID progression in that country. It's a very interesting story. And that's where complex factors affecting consumer behavior comes into picture. But let me start with my presentation now. Let me share my screen first. Can you see my screen?
Yes. Yes, we can.
So, reliable, timely decisions at scale require continuous learning from all emerging data, as we saw. Then you need to use those learnings for forward-looking insights. In the past, the analysis and insight teams would take historical data and do an analysis of what happened and try to discuss that and extrapolate that to figure out what is likely to happen. But then it all became complex and impossible for humans as well as traditional techniques in Excel and statistical modeling. So the second thing that needs to happen for reliable, timely decisions at scale is not only learn from all emerging data and factors, but use those learnings in forward-looking insights, scenarios, and recommendations. And this is what we do in Singular Intelligence. We are building products, technologies, and services to enable this new paradigm, to do it at scale so that different divisions, different users, from marketing to supply chain, from across the whole value chain, can use it in an integrated way with a one view of truth. And the interesting thing is that we are trying to do it, make it possible for direct business use rather than have intermediaries. And that's what we are. We call ourselves an applied AI company focused on decision automation. Our focus is there on FMCG value chain, so consumer goods and retail, e-commerce, the various models of businesses in this value chain are our focus. If you see that, the genesis of such a company is in three different parts, I would say. One is the focus on the consumer goods sector, so understand deeply the processes and the technical challenges and come out with products like Catman AI or supply chain AI, who focus on marketing and supply chain aspects of it, as well as have an ecosystem of partners, teams who have the necessary experience in this area, from the market understanding side to emerging technology side. And so these products have been proven with global FMCG, retail, e-commerce in various pilots and rollouts. We all know the big problem in FMCG value chain, that is volatile, chaotic, uncertain, and ambiguous. It has become worse with pandemic, as we saw in the earlier presentation. Its aftermath on economy, and now the ongoing war is only going to make it more complicated with its impact on pricing and costs. So we consider this topic very timely for managing business planning in these uncertain times. Let's look at what is reliable demand forecast. To put it simply, it's the best possible understanding of future demand. But it's not a single number. It needs to be a number with known uncertainties and risks around it, with a clarity of understanding on drivers of that forecast, and also how those drivers are changing with time in future, and granularity at the same time to be able to break it down precisely across the market structure, store types, channels, formats, and also in the product hierarchy from category to brand to product types. So reliable demand forecast is not a single number. It needs to be granular. It needs to have the associated risks and uncertainties, which gives us an idea of how to use it in business planning. Also, the drivers should be understood, how they are affecting in terms of direction as well as quantum. And in a volatile, chaotic market, we need to update it regularly, cost effectively, efficiently over time. So in the past, it used to be the case that companies will produce a forecast every year for the next year. That time is gone. All the data that was relevant to producing those forecasts become obsolete very quickly. So they started moving from the year to quarters, maybe half year. And now at this point of time, we need to update forecasts on a monthly basis to be able to use it effectively in our business planning for strategy development as well as in-flight optimization. So that's what is the context of reliable demand forecast. As we have seen, traditional forecasting is not that accurate, reliable. It cannot scale because of the manual time-taking process involved in it, and you can't quantify factors. But AI-based forecasting gives you a higher understanding of, better understanding of forecast, more accurate, it's more scalable, and you can identify and quantify those factors. So not only you can identify what factors are driving performance, sales, market share, or going up and going down, but also quantify them. You can understand shifts in consumer behavior. And then finally, the most important thing is you can use the technology very easily to simulate different scenarios and to prepare a strategic tactical response. And that's the greatness of AI-based forecasting, that it enables those kind of features and for business use directly. So let's have a view of this solution. Now let's look at a bit more in detail of the market uncertainty. The drivers are classified along different lines, and they are so many, from the drivers in the market mix bucket, pricing distribution, to macroeconomic, the personal disposable income, unemployment, consumer price index, to the events that happen every year. And surprisingly, pandemic may be affecting us for the last 3 years, but it is affecting us differently every year, and you can't use historical data there as well. So how do you use anomalies, market anomalies and pandemics coming into the mix of market, and understand the impact, as well as predict it for future and use it in your business planning? A more well-known and developed science is about weather, which is now forecasted with a certain accuracy or inaccuracy, we would say. But its use in forecasting is not so well developed and mature. And that's no less a factor, a combination of temperature, precipitation, and other factors can create a new consumer shift for a short term, and that needs to be taken into account to explain much of the behavior of consumer and market. And so that's the thing that we tend to bucket in AI-based forecasting in data sourcing and harmonization along different buckets, and then use clear matrices to quantify them, which is then fed into an ensemble of AI models to learn underlying data patterns and establish relationships, and then quantify impact of various factors on the performance. So here the thing is, you create a scenario of drivers, you predict those drivers, and then you use those drivers in an ensemble modeling approach to forecast, and then break down the direction and impact of the various drivers. So it's a three-stage process here in AI modeling of forecast. The solution typically would have three different layers: a data workbench, an AI modeling intelligent engine, and a dynamic portal which brings out scenarios, forecasts, breakdowns, allows you to simulate for the business user, or an API-based integration to other solutions from here. So that's the thing. A detailed automated process would have solutions for each stage, which is important, from getting all the data that we have spoken about earlier, harmonizing it for the purpose of a continuous modeling from here on, an automated exploratory data analysis, which creates features and importance of features to be used in the model in an automated way, to finally getting the outcome, and then use a new solution which is also automated to decompose the drivers, the relative importance of those drivers, and the quantitative impact of those drivers, which is then used in the next stage in simulation and reports. I will show you some examples. So this is an example where we are talking about consumer trends and market drivers. As I said, it is possible to get all the data and then understand how consumer shift is happening across different channels, across different products. I gave you an example of that we might have historical data of soap bar and soap liquid, but at the same time there is a shift between both of them, and this is driven by not only changing demand but also a consumer behavior that is driven by macroeconomic situation in the particular segment a country. So this is basically an initial analysis being brought visually that breaks down the different drivers of consumer shifts. A forecast over the next 18 months may look like this, with a graph and the various scenarios that you see. There is a baseline forecast, there is a optimistic consumer boom, then the pessimistic scenarios of consumers still having hesitancy, long COVID, which is a scenario today, as well as return of inflation. So the various uh, standard scenarios that can be configured in the system, as well as giving the user details and graphical view of the forecast, and then a forecast breakdown. The forecast breakdown takes into account the various buckets of drivers and analyzes how these drivers are affecting the forecast. Can I request Rahul to discuss this in a bit more detail?
Sure, Sarvesh. Hello, everyone. On your screens to your top left, you may see that sales has been effectively broken down into various factors that ultimately affect it. You can see underlying growth, consumer behavior, macro, marketing, and weather, as Sarvesh had explained earlier. The constructs of these variables have been explained, right? So the sum total of all of these factors, when added up column wise, would eventually add up to the total sales. Yeah. And interestingly, I mean, each of these factors again can be further split into a variety of other metrics. For example, your marketing mix can be split into price and distribution, because those were the variables which were eventually used in the model. So one may be able to learn and then talk about what actually is driving sales between price and distribution. Is it price, distribution, or eventually both of them? Similarly, another interesting bucket that is shown there is the consumer behavior bucket. It tries to explain how the behavior has been affected due to COVID. Again, in the behavior is explained in three different ways. Due to the rise in the cases or deaths, how does sales get affected? Because of COVID, there have been a lot of restrictions imposed in a lot of countries. So, how have these restrictions of movements affected them? Again, these are eventually captured as direct effect on sales. Um, Also, because of restrictions, the supply chain would have also been disrupted. The availability of products would have taken a hit. So this increase in restrictions, how has it affected our supply chain, and again indirectly, and eventually how has it affected sales? So an indirect route or an indirect impact of COVID is also sort of captured in the model. All right, and an interesting use case which Sarvesh already talked about, that we have observed is um, the shift in the consumption pattern between soap bars and liquid soap. Again, after COVID, factors like hygiene have become so important and so relevant in determining the product choice, that eventually other drivers have taken a backseat. And that's the point that Sarvesh had made earlier, that your drivers keep changing with time, and it is important for us to be more relevant in our modeling approach so that we capture these changes. Again, coming back to our story of how the liquid soap has become the more dominant product choice over soap bars, we see even the forecast that has been projected indicates further growth in liquid soaps over bars. Again, despite all the price rises due to inflation, rising crude oil prices, it becomes important that hygiene has overtaken all the other parameters, and how do we use this attribute or leverage this in furthering our revenues. So that's the kind of insights we can probably generate through the breakdown of the different factors. Yes, Avish, over to you.
Thanks, Rahul. So taking it to a different level, because it's an augmented automated scenario building, you can use the front-end based features to build a number of scenarios, and scenarios that correspond to your realities, economic business realities. A number of companies are building these kind of scenarios that baseline is baseline with if the current situation continues the way it is. And then situations like long COVID, which is the most preferred right now, the two preferred scenarios right now, long COVID, that COVID is in some form here, a new variant, even though there is, governments may have lifted restrictions in various countries, the consumer behavior is cautious and they are getting affected in some way or other. Return on inflation, the cost rise, the supply chain costs that have gone up, price rise is happening, and how is it affecting? So a scenario built around those assumptions. A consumer boom could be a scenario when you assume that consumers are now bringing out their saved money to buy things, and there is a higher purchase ability. I think in 22 and maybe parts of 23, at least for the next 12 months, long COVID and supply chain disruption will keep on affecting our thinking, and those scenarios would be the most preferred scenarios to build. So how do you build this? You don't have to really, in a solution like ours, build this by hand or manual. This is automated, and you choose and define and enter values to build these scenarios. So a typical simulate scenarios screen will look like this, that the different drivers are clubbed here, like you see the market mix, macroeconomy, COVID-19, weather, and you could change either slider or enter values and then predict, and you get the numbers underneath. So you can simulate scenarios. So product, when I said a business user driven product, a change of paradigm where the backend engine is automated and it's taking away the grunt work, produces this output, is what the new paradigm is. Between data, insight, and decisions scenarios, there is very little time wasted. Instead of months, it is a matter of hours. You can use those scenarios to build, to do comparisons, the different comparisons, and choose what is the most appropriate thing for you. So this is about concluding everything, a forecast, drivers of demand, scenario simulation, a granular detailed forecast, drivers of demand, scenario simulation is the core. From here around, you can use this to build a more robust pricing strategy, with full understanding of evolving future, a better supply planning, a better promotional plans, and also have inputs for new product strategy in terms of finding out white spaces that are emerging, as well as marketing in media. The great thing here is that instead of choice categories of brands and for a certain limited future, this kind of solution gives you the ability to scale it for all categories, brands, formats, SKUs, channels, consumer segments across all key markets, countries. And so you build a highly robust predictive competency within the company for a different type of business. So essentially, this is like you have an AI strategy and planning assistant, which can work at scale at low cost and expands across the whole company, integrating with your current systems and answering you all of those questions that you always wanted, but did not get the right answers. Not only the sales forecast, but drivers details for channels and categories and ability to download. And that's what is the new paradigm we are talking about. A typical engagement that we do initially consists of doing a pilot for one or two categories for a country, and then scale it up to all categories at a global level, which gives you the ability to have a forecast at the level of detail we have talked about, spanning countries and categories, and also the ability to update on monthly basis, always on for business users. Ben, over to you.
Thank you, Savesh. Thank you, Hans. Very interesting. So we did get a few questions that were sent me. So maybe I can kick it off. No particular order. I'm just looking through them. I think what people often are interested in, we learned about the theory, but what about the practicalities of singular intelligence and getting this off the ground? How big an effort is this? How long does it take to get started with this to actually have better forecasting data? Maybe a question to you, Savesh.
Yes, very good question. And this is again, gives the opportunity to talk about the totally different paradigm in which we operated. To get it off the ground, the easiest thing to do is to leverage your third-party market data, the data that you already have. So this is why we have the partnership with Nielsen. And if that is the case, it doesn't take long for us. We have a platform and you have Nielsen data, and we can start for the category pilot, which can take from days to maybe a week or something to test it out for your circumstances, and then onboard you category and country wise over the next few weeks. We have done, and we can do currently 100 cells onboarding in a matter of 6 to 8 weeks. 100 cells means, let's say, 20 markets and 5 categories.
Then maybe I'll pick up another question that, Savesh, maybe you can answer, maybe you choose not to, but what people always want to know is, how much budget do I need for this? Is this only for really big companies, and do I have to wait for the next budget cycle to be able to engage? Is there a typical price for a typical project, or is it completely custom?
Let me answer it in this manner. The reason we built this product, the product vision itself, is to democratize AI capability in enterprises. And so the value proposition is unit cost of prediction should come down so much that everyone can use it. And large companies, of course, can use it at scale, which we have done already in at least one FMCG company. But mid-sized companies where they can't even afford one data scientist, they can adopt it and onboard at a much lower cost, a fraction of the cost of getting a data scientist to do some analysis of their data. Okay. So it's very cost effective. The cost barriers are going down as it happens in any new technology adoption. Does that answer your question, Ben?
It was my question, but I presume it answers. Whoever wants detailed costs, I assume, can just email you directly and you can get in touch with them. So maybe we leave it at that. Sure. But I'm sticking with that theme of like the more practical applications of this. Once this is set up, how does it practically work? Is this something that companies then can use themselves? You showed us a dashboard, run their own forecasts, or do they need to continuously engage with singular intelligence every time they want to run a different scenario?
It's meant for self-serve. it runs, it's supported by us in terms of any data updates or any technical work that needs to be done in the backend. But all the forecast, the details of the forecast, the ability to simulate scenarios is done directly by the business users. A normal finance manager, category manager, CMI, consumer and market insight people, like they use a Word document or a PowerPoint document on web, they drill down on Tableau or any of those tools, they can use this tool to choose the variables and create and simulate scenarios and get the outputs. It's so easy to use. There's nothing to be done which is technical or scientific in nature.
Okay. Maybe one more question that I think will be interesting. You said a lot about accuracy, and this is, in volatile markets, what Hans, pointed out, it can be quite hard to forecast. And I know this from my own experience. Sometimes we've been very close and sometimes we've been far off. And it's always been a bit of an art and a science. So Sarvesh, you make this more scientific. Do you have a typical accuracy?
Well, it's a very interesting question. Quality of forecast that is reliable and usable in business planning requires you to have a forecast that is where the accuracy is known, where the uncertainties and variances are also known, because you would typically use the accuracy, uncertainty, and variances in business planning, let's say supply planning, how much more you should have or how much less you should have to minimize your losses. So then using those forecasts is an important thing, which requires risk, uncertainties, and the forecast number and the granular details as well. Accuracies in the industry right now have been in the range of 70 to 80% at an average with traditional techniques. And I know large companies, and I'm in touch with them. Some of them have in-house teams who do that for them. Some of them have external teams who do that for them. And some of them are getting it done by agencies. So their average accuracy has not gone beyond 70 to 80%, even in an environment where there was no pandemic and there was no market anomaly. In the case of AI-based forecasting, we are able to keep it more than 90% to the level of 95% by the techniques, by the unknowns that we are able to explain.
Thank you. And then last question that came directly to me, and then I saw we have a question general to everyone that we do after that. Last question here was, it says like always updated, always fresh. What does that mean in reality? How frequently, is this updated? How fresh are these forecasts that are run with Singular Intelligence?
So I had shown a slide where the different drivers of forecast were shown, where we are talking about what are the factors affecting sales. And they were all market mix, they were COVID-related factors, weather-related factors. What changes in the market? The weather-related factors, we get forecast of weather every day. You can actually get an hourly weather forecast, but we don't use that. We have a daily weather forecast, weekly weather forecast. We have COVID data coming in every day. So cases, deaths, mobility coming in every day. We have other data types which have different frequencies from daily, weekly to in some cases in developed market, the sales data is coming monthly as in developing markets. But in most of the developed markets, we get sales data weekly. If we get data, not the third-party market data like Nielsen, for example, we have tried it with EPOS data. There, the data is daily sales. So our system can use all of these different periodicities on a daily basis and update it. So always on means as soon as the new data is available, it goes and runs the models to make it accurate as of that date.
Right. And then question here that went out to everybody. What if we don't know much about the features of the domain? Can univariate analysis with very strong algorithm, LSTM, work? That is a very technical question.
Yeah, I know what he means, Akash. Thanks for the question. Good question. It will not work. Because as much as you would think that the short-term information in the LSTM is giving you an idea of what is likely to happen, there are many other factors that impact the forecast, and they need to be taken into account. So the methodology that we are using also uses LSTM, but it uses a combination and ensemble of modeling and LSTM as a part of it.
Sarvesh, if I may add to it.
Yes, please.
So, so what we are dealing with is causal forecasting. So it involves both art and science. Now, the art is basically involved in the feature selection, and technology does aid us in automating this entire process of feature selection. Univariate analysis is one such tool that we employ. We also employ a variety of other tools like your trend analysis, looking at correlations, building weak learner models, which eventually, like Sarvesh mentioned, are used in our ensemble models. So again, we also have a good amount of industry or domain expertise within the organization, which also brings in the functional or the explanatory part of the art part, right? So that's how a combination of all of these together helps us get to more accurate forecasting results.
Okay. So one other question that just came in to me, I think that is interesting maybe for people. You know, Sarvesh, if you use a lot of data, that data often have different forms, right? Your model seems to be able to, pull in a lot of, different data. How do you manage that challenge, I know I work a lot with data companies, and they tell me 90% is preparing the data. Once you've done all that, it's easy. What's your perspective on that?
Very good question, Ben. In the world of AI, data and absence of it, we learn from both. The simulation aspects, which is the absence of it, is slightly more complicated, and I will not deal with it right now, but let's just focus on data side, which is where all of us are used to. A lot of data. How do you manage that? Data preparation is so important. Data quality is so important. Your model cannot be more accurate than the data quality you have. Everybody has said that, but that's where the challenge is. Why is what is there in data, you can use that on a simple model and understand to some extent how the future might look like. But there are unknowns that they need to be identified and found. So the unknowns, we have developed new techniques coming from AI as well as game theory, because it brings together all factors. So unknowns can be determined and simulation can be done for those unknowns. But to prepare data at a very basic level is something for that we have, because we focus on one industry, consumer goods and retail. There we have restricted the complexity by focus on industry domain. We have developed techniques by which we have created automation and APIs in processing data from the source to a harmonized level, which can go to the solution. And that's where building a product is of great importance, rather than doing new things every time, where you have to deal with new challenges of data harmonization. So the productization here is, as I said, there is a data workbench which picks up data from all of these sources, cleans up, standardizes, and prepares it for system in a semi-automated or automated manner. Why I say semi-automated? Because we still want to check them at various stages that the algorithms are performing to the right level.
Right. I think we're almost at time. I think we probably close the question and answer now. And
I think there is a question from Akash again in the chat as a follow-up. I would quickly reflect on that. He says that sometimes challenges we don't understand domain, and hence we don't have more than one feature. Akash, this is the challenge that you will have to overcome. Because if you do not understand the domain, building an applied AI solution is not possible. Domain understanding at depth is key.
Okay. And I guess if any more questions come up, you're very welcome to directly email Sarvesh or Hans. And then thank you for joining our webinar today.